Hi, everyone. Welcome to Us and Flux Conversations from the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. My name is Bob Beard. I'm a project manager at the center where we use the tools of speculative fiction to get people thinking more optimistically about the future. And we've been doing this since March, using stories across a wide swath of genres and styles to help us work through the very strange timeline we're now occupying. Our latest story for Us in Flux is The Wandering City by Usman T. Malik. Usman is a Pakistani-American writer whose fiction has been reprinted in several Best of the Year anthologies, including the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy Series. He's won the Bram Stoker Award, the British Fantasy Award, and has been nominated for World Fantasy Awards and the Nebula. He's also the co-founder of the Salam Award for Imaginative Fiction. And we're going to talk more about Usman's story, The Wandering City, in just a bit. If you haven't read it, please feel free to go to csi.asu.edu/usinflux, open it up, and follow along. Here's a teaser. If you haven't read it, 3 words: paranormal, architecture, event. And so to chat with us about architecture, supernatural and otherwise, we reached out to James Graham. James is an architect and historian who teaches at the California College of the Arts. Since 2013, he's been the director of the Columbia Books on Architecture and the City, as well as the founding editor of the Avery Review, a digital journal of critical essays on architecture. So thank you both for being here. James, Usman, thank you.
Yeah, pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, and thank you all in the audience for watching. We're looking forward to a really great chat. I think you'll be very pleased. And as we go along, if you have questions for either of the gentlemen, please enter it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So let's get started, shall we? First of all, Usman, I wondered if you might give an overview of the story for folks who may not have read it yet.
Sure, Bob. So The Wandering Cities, the basic premise is that a 9th century enchanted city appears one fine day in the middle of Lahore, on top of the Mughal gardens, very famous Mughal gardens called Shalimar Bagh. And the story is about people's reaction, the locals' reaction to the city, and how they respond to this new space within their space.
Excellent. So James, how does Usman's story resonate with your work in history, in architecture, and urban planning?
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, I would just say I enjoyed the story so much. As I've told Usman previously, I really appreciate this kind of a story because it leaves so much open. It's such a sort of richly detailed world, and yet it's one that leaves us a lot of space to kind of speculate and read into it, I think, which is perhaps my reaction to it as an architectural and urban historian. So I'm very grateful both for the text and to Joey and Bob for the invitation to be here today. Maybe for me, one of the things that I sort of encountered in this story, being a historian sort of the long 20th century of architecture and urbanism, I found myself thinking about how this seemingly fantastical occurrence, the sort of arrival of this pristine, mysterious city, for me really holds echoes of other forms of urbanization, all of which I think involve some sort of form of exclusion, the way urbanism always sort of marks an inside and an outside. And we sort of talked a bit about this previously, but I kind of see a bit of a timeline of sort of urbanization that might relate to Lahore and other similar contexts. One would be the sort of history of colonial planning projects, which is always the sort of arrival in a similar way of a kind of complete and total urbanism in a sort of sudden way. And I think here about the so-called model town neighborhood of Lahore by the Indian engineer and architect Ganga Ram, which took the British Garden City model and sort of imported it into Lahore. It's a wild plan. It's this perfect square with a kind of perfectly circular central park inside. And then, you know, a sort of later generation, if that would be the sort of early 20th century version, a later 20th century version might be sort of after independence and partition, and the sort of role of international expertise and urban planning in remaking the cities and the capitals of decolonizing states, Pakistan and elsewhere. And the sort of construction of these new nation state capitals, which similarly, they sort of arrive overnight, at least in terms of a sort of larger urban history. These are totally planned kind of sudden projects, and they're ones that are both deeply representative of the new states, but also carry a sort of certain destructive capacity that I think the story of the Wandering City kind of carries so nicely. And then finally, I think for me, in much more in the 21st century, the story connects so thoughtfully to the politics of preservation under UNESCO, where the notion of a sort of global patrimony often rubs up against the lived lives of these sorts of sites. One of the things that I think is so interesting in this story is that after the arrival of this sort of deeply supernatural phenomenon, you get all of the sort of typical post-UNESCO activity, the clearing out of certain forms of life, often including death, which takes place in the city and takes place in real life as well, the sort of springing up of these kind of provisional forms of commerce around it, the sort of designation of these governmentally controlled zones of exclusion. And so for me, I think, you know, reading this story of the imagination, I think really actually speaks very much to a lot of the cultural politics around architecture, heritage, and preservation in the 20th and 21st century. And I think for me, just maybe to say one more sort of quick thing on that, there's always been in the discourse around preservation, the idea that what buildings do, what monuments do, is to sort of synchronize time, to give us the sense that there was some lived historical moment that gets captured through architecture. And what I think is so interesting about this story is how sort of this time, in that not only do we have this kind of immaculate that remains occupied but frozen, and the sort of the kind of recurrence of these daily rituals, sort of like clockwork. I mean, the city is here sort of figured as a kind of clockwork automaton, which I think in some ways is the ultimate fantasy of architectural preservation, that you can count on architecture to sort of be experienced and to perform in these sort of cyclical ways. So for me, just to kind of put it all together, I mean, this story was really, I think, a wonderfully sort of condensed crystallization of what it means to think about historical interventions in the city in the present day, because our encounter with historical architecture is often as sort of strange and sort of supernatural as the arrival of this city.
Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you know, I wanted to talk about a little bit how this story also echoes throughout the centuries, because your story, The Wandering City, is inspired by a story from the Arabian Nights called The City of Brass. And I wondered, Usman, if you might talk a little bit about that story in particular and how it informed your ideas for this story.
So, you know, thank you so much for that amazing insight, James, and for the question, Bob. You know, I, as a kid, a lot of Pakistanis and Muslims grew up reading the Alif Laila Walail, which is 1001 Nights. And as a kid, I read the abridged, all sex removed version of the Arabian Nights. So, and which is kind of really very different from the actual text. And there are several texts. It's not one text, different versions. The City of Brass actually has 4 or 5 versions that I could find online. And I sort of went through all of them. And it was just funny because I was looking into the research for a different project. And I sort of ran across this idea. And the idea was that this caliph hears that there are these bottles with genies in them that just float in this river somewhere in the, you know, in the Maghrib, which is Africa, basically. And so he asked his vizier, how could I look at these genies in these bottles? And the vizier says, well, why don't you send a contingent, you know, a regiment, and they'll go look for them. So the City of Brass is about their journey to this remote place and finding a guide. And along the way, they find this weird brass soldier the brass soldier has this spear that it's pointing, and there's an inscription, please press my belly button and I will show you the way, or something like that. And so, and the brass soldier spins and shows them the new direction, which they have to follow to get to the city of brass. And the city of brass is exactly pretty much the city that I described in the story. It has huge black stone walls, and these people don't know why these people are in there. They've been there for hundreds of years, and there's a queen in there, which sort of, a lot of that I skipped over. But the bottom line was, the city of brass is supposed to be, by a lot of historians and scholars of Arabian literature, to be the most mystical story in the entirety of Arabian Nights. It is a story which has reminders which are very interestingly familiar to Quranic and biblical inscriptions. There are verses literally quoted later on by, or I don't know, maybe the verses came after Rumi did, because there are verses from Rumi in the city of brass, and they're reminders of death. I was Shaddad the Great, and I built this kingdom, and now I am in this dark and narrow house of death. So city of brass was meant to show the evanescence of life. I think that was the purpose of the entire story initially. And it was just fascinating to me to imagine the city with people preserved for hundreds of years. And I wondered, there's a line in one of the scholarly texts about the city coming to the visitor, not the visitor coming to the city. So in the story, The Wandering City, there's a scene where these folks, they bring this telescopic crane and they extend the boom, and the boom's height matches the exact height of the city's walls. That's from that scholarly text. That happens in one of the versions because the city comes to the visitor. And so there was so much to play with. It was just literally awe-inspiring for me as a reader. And I wanted to see what I could do with it if I brought it over to Pakistan and let the locals play with this new shiny toy, and how deadly that toy might end up being. So that's sort of the city of brass's background. I hope that's helpful.
No, I love that. What I thought was really interesting, and you talk about sort of the spirit of life and death, and what I found really interesting is that the appearance of the Wandering City, it's very sudden, and it's tragic and it's fantastic, but then it pretty much just becomes just another fact of life in Lahore, right? Its existence is mundane. The citizens, they very quickly sort of adapt to it, and they just revert to their social scripts. Money is made. Entrepreneurs, set up, different stands at each end of the city. There's conspiracy theories. There's even attempts to bureaucratize this supernatural event. So I wondered if the two of you might talk a little bit about that. What do you make of that?
I mean, I'd be happy to quickly start and say that, I mean, in the moment that we're living through, this sort of coronavirus moment, I think is such a sort of perfect demonstration of some of the kind of tenets of, whether you think of it as disaster capitalism or something else, where anytime some sort of major sort of ground shaking event takes place, there will always be sort of forces that move in to capitalize on it. And whether those forces are governmental or corporate or individual, entrepreneurial, it always depends. But there's always a sort of immediate urge and a sort of need to respond to these things, because they've become like any sort of disruption in the normal becomes a potential site of intervention. And so I think that's something that I find really fascinating and sort of compelling about the story. That's exactly the case. And I think one of the things that sort of struck me on the second reading also was that there's a very sort of rapid shift in the way the city is sort of knowable. Like when it first lands, it's this opaque wall. And you sort of picture it as you would in maybe a different century, where you would need a sort of ladder, or you wouldn't even be able to get in. So it's just this mysterious wall. But very quickly, you have the boom, and then you move on to more sort of advanced technologies, like you picture like the drone flying over, whatever, sort of getting these images where you start to see into the city. And the way the sort of 21st century allows a sort of visibility of the urban, I think is really interestingly portrayed here, because all of a sudden this thing, like I can just see how it would go, like it becomes mapped, it becomes known, people start sort of naming the landmarks and sort of documenting this new phenomenon, which I think is a sort of fascinating and very contemporary way to encounter some sort of strange new urbanism, is to make it knowable in that way.
Yeah, I was nodding along when James was speaking because, there are a couple of interesting things about that. One is, human beings are creatures that look for solutions. So if there's a massive problem, they may get stunned for a little while, but once the initial shock wears off, it just becomes a problem to be solved. It's sort of like this, this rock in the river, and the water is going to find its way somehow around it. So that was one of the ways I sort of envisioned the appearance of the city. The other one, there's interestingly data. There's actual medical data that shows that when human beings are struck by a sudden beautiful vision, the brain is completely filled with awe for a little while. But then the synapses start adapting. And so the initial awe of, for example, we know James is in South Carolina. It's a very pretty place. He's got mountains. He might have forests outside. So when he first appears and gets the first glimpse, he's gonna be awestruck. It's gonna be beautiful. 2 days in, it's gonna be normal life. And so there's actual medical data that shows that the brain adapts to that presence. And so that was another way of me thinking about what would people do. And the funny thing is, online, when some folks read the story, especially Pakistanis, and I really get a kick out of when Pakistanis pick up the familiar, and because they get amused. And a lot of people said that's exactly what they would do. Especially one of the lines in the story is when the Prime Minister says, it's our current Pakistani Prime Minister's favorite line is "Ghabrana nahi hai," fear not, fear not. And it's sort of become this joke in political circles. And so when that line happened, I got like 7-8 comments from people that they laughed out loud when they read that. And so that sort of response, it's just, I just basically wrote what I thought would happen.
That actually really aligns nicely. Rahel in the comments says, is there anything Usman sees as a uniquely Pakistani about this story? So if you haven't already answered that, Usman, I think we'd like to hear from that. And also, just a reminder, if you have a question for the panelists, go ahead and put it down in the Q&A section, but we'll let Usman address that if you like.
One of my favorite things to do and play with is pick up tropes from all over the world and see how they would play in an indigenous setting. And it's sort of become my hallmark. People comment on it now. They sort of expect that from my stories. So this story is basically set in a city that's 2,000 years old. Lahore is 2,000 years old. And so that crashing of the past and the present and the future potentially in that story, and the very indigenous things, because the place where the city lands is actually where I work these days. So it's exactly where I go to work every day. And I could see all those places and the GT road and the highway traffic and the carts. I think everything about the story is pretty much as Pakistani as it could be.
Sandra asks, and this is a follow-up, let me see if I can pull this up. Have you thought about expanding this story into something longer? If you did, do you have an idea of the directions you would take with the Wandering City or other places that it might show up? I think when at the beginning of the story, it's leaving Tennessee and then it shows up in Lahore, and then we don't know where it goes after that, right?
So it's leaving Florida. It was initially Tennessee, then I changed it to Florida because I lived in Florida for a little while. So it sort of was kind of like me moving from Florida to Lahore. Flowers for Algernon is a very famous science fiction story that Daniel Keyes wrote. And he followed that by writing a novel, which turned into a movie. And I have always been interested by something like that, but I don't think that I would probably expand this into a full novel length. I think the potency of this story, particularly, is in the very small encapsulation, that little sudden shock that you get. I mean, I could do tons with it, but it would just not be that much fun anymore. So probably not. I'm sorry.
Could I just sort of like expand like briefly on that thought, which is that I often think about the fact that in the 1980s at NASA, when James Hansen and these other climate scientists really came to terms with global warming happening on the planet Earth, it's because they were studying other planets. They were looking at Venus and Mars, and Earth was the sort of control that then they realized, like, wait, our control is actually changing. And I think one of the things that's really interesting to think about this wandering city is that maybe landing in Lahore is the one that would be proper for Usman's work. But the idea that it sort of opens up the possibility of a sort of like, you know, comparative wandering city studies type situation, because I think what's interesting to me in this is that whatever is universal about this encounter would probably be whatever it is that's universal about things like UNESCO, like the sorts of structures that are kind of obliged around it. And then the response to that is going to be so particular, so sort of culturally rooted to a particular site. And so the idea that the story would be written, perhaps by different authors in different contexts, I think would make the sort of kind of ritualistic nature of the story reveal all of those kind of distinctly local particularities that make it ring true in a given context. So I think it's an interesting kind of thought experiment that would maybe need to be a collective fiction to sort of actualize in that way.
So Bob, before we go on, I just wanted to say James made such an interesting thing. And the moment he started saying that, I, I started thinking about an anthology, because, you know, you could get a Wandering City anthology with the city popping up in different areas. You know, we have, I think one of the participants is in Nigeria currently. I mean, we got Ken Liu, we've got Neddy, we've got N.K. Jemisin, we've got tons of, you know, Afrofuturism, we've got South Asian, we got India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Kashmir. I mean, it could be a really fun project, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I would lead it, but it sounds like a very interesting project. I think James really expanded that for all of the people who might be listening to this.
Yeah, you heard it here first, right here. Trademark. I'm gonna in this somehow. I do want to talk about this idea of global disruption and a global consciousness, because, you know, certainly, you know, there's not a spreading city. There is currently a spread of a pandemic. You know, climate change is, you know, a specter that we've been dealing with for some time. So, you know, taking a more optimistic view of things, if we can do that, you know, what sort of advances do you think can be made in this moment where there is sort of a burgeoning global consciousness? I think, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, you know, someone said that, you know, the pandemic is doing what, you know, climate change could not. Like, it didn't mobilize people in the same way that this pandemic did. So, you know, as a historian, James, like, you know, are there historical precedents around these sort of global moments?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, because I think for me, the struggle of any planetary question is that on the one hand, we desperately have to develop something of a kind of planetary consciousness, like a collective we, that we know that this we is sort of floating through space on our island home together, and that there's a sort of sense of stewardship and solidarity and collaboration that comes out of that. And yet at the same time, we have to recognize the deeply differentiated nature of how these things impact people. And I was so struck early in COVID about people describing it as the great leveler, because, you know, Boris Johnson got it too, as well as everybody else. But then, of course, as the sort of the data and the numbers have continued to come out, particularly in the United States, but I think really globally, it immediately reveals the disparities in how people are affected by this, how communities are affected. That's the same with climate change. It's the same with COVID. It's the same with any of the sort of crises of global capitalism that we experience today. And so I think for me, the trick in this is like, how do we sort of occupy both subject positions at the same time? Like, how do we imagine the sort of collective we, but at the same time, how do we respect and honor the sort of differences in our own situations, our own sort of privilege within this? But in terms of, I mean, I have to say that for me, in my own lifetime, I do not see any sort of precedent to this. It's been a spectacular change where within a matter of weeks and months, things that were totally unthinkable have become thinkable. Positions that were sort of fringe positions in the United States, things like whether it was universal basic income or the socialization of healthcare, are all of a sudden on the table again. And of course, in the US, then it's like sort of socialized medicine for this virus, but maybe not the rest. I mean, like, of course, these things become sort of wrapped up in the usual kind of political methods, but it seems very unprecedented to me in that respect. And I hope that there will be ways to continue to mobilize it, because we've seen that we can actually, sort of at the drop of a hat, retool our ways of life, retool our economies, like retool our consumption of resources, sometimes in positive ways, sometimes in negative ways. I think the styrofoam takeout industry is probably booming while petroleum is declining. Like, these are the sort of give and takes that you get in this moment. So how we sort of leverage that, I think, is the question.
Mm-hmm. Usman, do you have thoughts on that?
No, I think James got it pretty much all covered. One of the ways for me, of looking at the wandering city was the striking of a sudden calamity and how people might respond to that. So I think James pretty much got it all covered.
I think, and building off of what James said, these events don't necessarily bring about new sort of like systemic changes themselves, right? They expose that these systems might be flawed, and I'm wondering if, especially sort of like the built environment is sort of an arena to let these sort of like struggles and disparities play out. The thing that I think of, and I don't know how accurate this is, so but I believe that like bike lanes in like Manhattan perhaps are a result of like transit strikes in the 80s. And don't quote me on that, but I that sounds right. So I wonder if you could talk about that, James. Is architecture in the built environment like the place where you see these sort of like these big changes sort of start to take place?
So I think for me, the answer is both yes and no. Unfortunately, you'll always find me striking sort of ambivalent answers. I personally think that realistically, one of the things that we'll see in the era of COVID is that the sort of access to security, to social distancing, to a sort of a kind of shield from the virus is something that's going to be differentiated according to one's means, basically. I think that will there be a sort of wholesale remaking of the city? I think likely not. I think that in very particular ways, you'll see an increasing level of safeguards coming in that sort of reflect the usual structures of who gets it and who doesn't. But at the same time, I think that, I mean, these are absolutely moments where we can start to imagine sort of redrawing the lines of what it means to be in public. There's a sort of classic architecture meme where you have a sort of image of something that has things drawn on the floor, and you always call it floor.dwg because that's the file extension for like an AutoCAD drawing. And you see it popping up a lot, literally in, you go into the grocery store, you go into the pharmacy, you're in public parks, and there are lines on the ground, or there are dots on the ground, or these sort of bubbles. And the fact that the way we draw the ground plane changes the way that people occupy the city, assuming that they accept the rules of what those lines mean, sort of shows how powerful architecture can be. If you took a photograph like 2 months ago, 3 months ago, of people standing in line at a coffee shop and they're spaced out 8 feet each, you'd say, like, what strange world is this? Like, why are people behaving so weirdly? But now it's become totally normal. And so the fact that we can use design on a sort of local scale to create that kind of change, I think is really interesting. And certainly I was talking about this earlier with this too, cities like Paris. Paris redrew a great deal of its road plans during COVID to increase bike lanes, to change the nature of automotive traffic. I think a lot of cities are hoping to mobilize this moment to sort of put into effect plans that have been imagined earlier, hopefully to give back more of the public domain to the public rather than cars, for example, because that's what allows sort of increased use of the city. Permitting for street-side cafes in New York, it used to take years and expediters and $20,000 or whatever, and now you can do it overnight. So these sorts of changes, I think, help us imagine a different city.
So, as James was talking, I was thinking about the impact on healthcare in particular, because, that's sort of part of my, area of expertise. The Mayo Clinic in the US, they had this timeline where they wanted to go from, so the Mayo is big on precision medicine, on targeted medicine, precision medicine. One of the things that they have, which they're lucky to have, is huge chunks of data. And while they have, produced a lot of papers, and Mayo has been leading the publications in the last 3 months, one thing that they hadn't quite done and they had a timeline for was the use of artificial intelligence in healthcare, and fusion of AI with precision medicine and data use to do a lot of things. So the Mayo just announced they're going to bring that in 2 years instead of 12. So that's a big, big acceleration for a healthcare system. And Mayo is probably the only entity on the planet that can probably do it right now. The other thing, so as opposed to that, in Pakistan, the healthcare system is significantly flawed. We have a lot of gaps in access. We don't have any insurances. So a lot of coverage is out of pocket. So the government in the last 3-4 months has been establishing field hospitals, and they just opened, I think, 2 brand new hospitals. And for Pakistan, that sort of pace is unheard of. That simply doesn't happen. So I was just thinking about those 2 things in healthcare particularly. And, James was saying earlier about, COVID, but maybe Bob was saying, initially it was thought to be the great leveler, but then it was not. And you can even see that in sectors, right? Some sectors are getting accelerated much quicker than other sectors are. So just a couple of things that I thought I'd share.
Yeah. So as we go on, there's still questions rolling in. I do want to get to this question because this is something that's been in the back of my mind. From Julia, Usman, you often write horror. Do you think of this as a horror story? And do you think The Wandering City is scary?
Yeah. So, that's a very interesting question. I mean, there's a guy who falls to his death and then is eaten by ravens and shields. So it sort of is a horror story, I think. But I think that if we were to apply Ellen Datlow or another editor's definition of horror, it's probably not. The tone and the ending, I think it's more dark fantasy maybe than horror. I do think that there, Ted Chiang has a great story called, I think it's called Hell is the Absence of God, or Hell is the Absence of Angels, something like that, where the idea was that if angels actually appear to normal people, people would not be, grateful. They would be terrified. Angelic revelations would be terrifying. So I think the appearance of a city like this would be terrifying for at least a while. I mean, the city, in the context of the story, the city's intermittent apparitions are accepted globally. So people know this is going to happen, and they know the calamity is going to strike. They just don't know where. So in that context, people have gotten used to it. But the tone of this story is probably not horror.
Okay, so I'm gonna throw a total curveball, being sort of the horror aficionado that I am. James, do you think that there is something to say about the prevalence of architecture in horror? Like haunted houses, haunted hotels, Gothic castles, labyrinths. And any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that yes, absolutely. I mean, I think there are a few things that immediately come to mind. One of them is that I think part of what has to do with the sort of role of architecture in horror is a kind of disjunction in time. I think this is why things like the fact that you get the rise of the sham ruin at the same time as you get the invention of the Gothic novel. I mean, Horace Walpole being both a sort of avid amateur architect along with a writer, and you get the sort of untimeliness of architecture, I think is crucial to a lot of horror. And I think that the sort of capacity of architecture to represent in that way, either to represent something accessible or inaccessible, or to represent something sort of forbidding and out of reach. I mean, these are things that can be very directly designed. And so you do get an entire sort of lineage of architecture, particularly in the 19th century, that kind of takes that as its project. So I do actually see that connection for sure. I mean, I also think that one of the most mystifying things in architecture is something that doesn't seem to make sense, that doesn't have a kind of transparency to it. And that's why I think the wall is such a sort of effective architectural device, because it's the kind of architecture that you can't pass through, you can't see through. It becomes this kind of cryptic object, whether it's the sort of arrival of the monolith in 2001, or whether it's any number of sort of kind of walled architectures that create that sort of impenetrability. And I think the fear of what is not visible or not accessible is a kind of crucial element there. But I don't know, I haven't thought as much as I might on the questions of horror and architecture. For many people, modernism is one of the great horrors. For me, of course, it's my kind of stock in trade. But.
Sure. I do want to ask this question because one of the things that struck out to me in The Wandering City are the references to memorials and monuments and cultural preservation. And, of course, currently in the States, we're seeing this critical interrogation of monuments and this sort of idea of like, what is of historical importance? And so I wondered, as a historian and a planner, if you might talk about this a little bit, James, about sort of the debate that's happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I think for me, one of the things that's sort of fascinating about this moment is that historical monuments rarely actually document the history that they purport to document. I mean, I think when you look, I'm thinking especially because of my own, like where I went to college and where I came up, the sort of role of Confederate monuments was not really to sort of mark the war that ended in 1865. These were things that were built much later in the 20th century, often by like directly white supremacist groups to sort of mark that history at a remove. And so this is something that I think is really interesting about a lot of the kind of monuments discourse right now, is I think that really looking at the moment of their making to understand what sort of a worldview is actually embodied by those monuments, I think is a much more relevant conversation than the sort of like, oh, are we forgetting history by removing these things? Like, no, we're not. History is getting rewritten at very many moments in time, and it was rewritten, say, in the 1920s, when you get this proliferation of Robert E. Lee statues or other such things. So attention to of what it is that might have motivated monuments, I think, is as much of a question as the thing itself that's being marked by them.
Usman, is there a similar conversation about monuments in Pakistan, and do they sort of serve the same role?
So first, I must apologize. We just had a blackout, and I'm just happy that I'm connected to the internet, because this particular connection is it's a separate circuit. So that's why you're suddenly seeing me like the Exorcist monster in the dark. So, you know, that's sort of, so recently, just 4 days ago, there was a question about a new temple being built in Islamabad, or maybe Rawalpindi, I think. And, you know, immediately you had this polarized response online and in the political discourse. Why should we build a temple there? Then you have people on the other side, why should we not build a temple there? And then people started bringing their different, you know, questions. So in Pakistan, these questions of monuments are not as much as related to race as much to religion. And so religion sort of drives a lot of these issues. And one of the references that people kept talking about was the demolition of the Babri Mosque in India in the 90s. And it was a mosque, a Mughal mosque built by the Emperor Babur. And it was demolished by Hindu mobs, and, you know, it was a big, big event. It led to, you know, protests, and I believe there was, you know, there were deaths and killings that followed at some point. I don't remember the timeline exactly, but I'm quite sure that the Gujarat incident in India followed afterwards. So when we talk about monuments in Pakistan, that context has to be kept in mind. And all sorts of monument building or removal really flows post-partition along these currents of religion. So we don't have the conversation of race as much as religion, and we do get this, which is why when the city appears in Lahore, you have these, you know, these radicalized people who are angry because this scholar sort of has this episode inside the city, and now all of a sudden the city is a city of infidels, and they are trying to erase the presence of the city itself, which I thought was pretty much the you know, the central question of monument building. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to get to a couple questions and comments, and please do keep them coming. If you have questions or comments, go ahead and enter them in the Q&A. So Michael says that you've already sort of touched on this, but where do you think the Wandering City went next? Or is that a story for the anthology?
So thank you for the question. I don't know if there's ever going to be an anthology, you know, that it sounds fun, but I'm not sure. I don't know. I just let that question dangle, and I mean, now I sort of want to know. I didn't really think about that before. Could be anywhere. I think in my mind, I'm not sure why, there was this vague image of the city landing in Africa next, and I'm not sure why. And I don't know where in Africa, but I had this weird hazy thing because one of my beta readers is E. Lily Yu, who's a fantastic writer. And Lily basically said, hey, you know what, the city's gone, but we're living the times of Twitter. People are going to know in 5 minutes where the city went.
Yeah.
And so I never touched upon that question, but I did think about the possibility of maybe putting a hint in. And I think someplace in Western Africa was what I was thinking, but don't quote me on that.
Get your fan fiction in. James, any thoughts on where the Wandering City might have disappeared to or appeared next?
No, but I did find myself thinking, you know, what if in some way, my sort of paranoid sensibility about global structures of governance, since this is one of my own preoccupations, it made me think, like, what if the Wandering City is in fact a sort of secret form of UN-style developmentalism? I mean, I think it's interesting that the sort of effects that the city brings with it, the sort of stimulation of tourism, the stimulation of sort of local economies, there's a certain prestige involved. I mean, some of the locals are very concerned when the city leaves rather quickly, as if, like, were we good enough hosts of the city? And so it becomes this almost sort of Olympic style event. And so you can sort of imagine it, you know, in some ways operating similarly. And so I guess the sort of question of the where it goes next is sort of like, what does it mean to imagine these things like the Olympics, the World Fairs, like all of these kind of infrastructures of a sort of global sort of togetherness or global capitalism, like what happens when it's effectively randomized, or where there's no real sort of agency or kind of project behind it. It just comes, which I think is a really interesting question. But it would certainly trail those effects, and the effects would be very different depending on where it came, certainly.
Yamoku says, if you want a new location for the city, it could be Nigeria. Yamoku's currently in Nigeria and says there are many similarities in cultural norms and reactions. So yeah, there's a possible new story thread. I thought about that too. I thought about reading the story as like sort of a randomized, you know, Olympics, and how you would prepare for it, and how a city would sort of, you know, it's a looming concern. It's like, okay, well, at some point this city might show up here. What do we need to do to prepare for that? So yeah, I think that's a really interesting element of the world of this story too. Noor says, Usman, to your point about hallmarks of your stories and reader expectations, do you worry about getting pigeonholed by readers?
So, you know, that's a really good question about reader expectations and writers. You know, I'm blanking on where I read this or by whom, but one of the things as a writer that I like doing, and I mean, I know I write stories set in Pakistan, but I really like I really like expanding my wings, and I try not to stick with one tone or one theme. I try not to revisit the site of a story, the site of a crime, if you will. And I'd much rather move on to more interesting crime rather than return to this scene, you know, of the crime again and again. In terms of reader expectations, I think that if a writer pigeonholes themselves or let themselves be pigeonholed, and they create this brand, which involves, okay, I'm going to go to this book or this story and I'm going to find my comfort in it. Well, then you become comfort food. And that's a great thing for a lot of people. People have built, you know, lives on it. People have built their brand on it, series on it. I don't know if I'm quite there yet. And that's one of the things I like about short fiction. I don't have to stay in one world for too long. I can world hop, you know, from one second to the other. And I love that. So honestly, I try to surprise my readers as much as possible and give them something new. The only thing in my stories mostly that's common is pretty much that they're set in Pakistan.
I love that description though, that like, you know, maybe you are irreducibly you, but you're also a sort of wandering city unto yourself, like sort of appearing in some kind of new situation with a new set of coordinates that sort of reveals more about what your sort of elemental way of thinking is, and your way of writing, and your way of imagining the world that you sort of have now landed into. I like that description a lot.
Thank you.
I love that. You know, just to wrap up, and this is sort of like the common theme with this series series about like disruption, and you know how will we endure you know these big challenges that we're currently going through. And so I'd like to pose to both of you, you know, what is this story? What is this story about, you know, a paranormal architecture event, a wandering city? What does this story have to tell us about community? You know, does it provide a new definition of community? And what other sorts of questions open up as a result of this story?
I mean, I think maybe my answer to this would be that the thing that I think is often revealed in moments of sort of crisis on the urban scale is often a sense of a kind of unexpected solidarity or resiliency. On a very much smaller scale, I'm thinking about this because, Usman, I'm glad to see that the power is back. But the day that I moved to New York City in 2003 happened to be the day of the blackout in August of 2003 that blacked out the entire Northeastern corridor. And I have this sort of memory. I was like shoe shopping for an interview I had the next day. And then here I am with the rest of the city sort of walking across the bridges to commute home. And it was this sort of fascinating moment and gave me a very quick insight into what happens when the normal gets disrupted in a place like New York. And that bears out whether it's you think about 9/11, whether you think about Hurricane Sandy, whether you think about more mundane things like the transit strikes that you mentioned earlier. What they do is they forge sort of provisional senses of togetherness and resiliency. And for me, that's something that emerged very forcefully in the story also. There's a sort of common curiosity, but then between the characters, you feel this very sort of immediate common sort of intimacy of that experience, a sense of sort of mutual support, a sense that this is a thing that must be sort of dealt with, and so people deal with it as sort of best they know how. And that to me is I think very much a lesson of what it means to live in cities, because living in cities means living in a really intense proximity to others, and you don't notice it all the time, but there are the moments that reveal it to you. And certainly the arrival of the wandering city would be one such moment, I think, of revelation.
Yeah, I agree with James. Max Gladstone was talking about this the other day on Twitter, where he said that one of the things that irks him as a writer of dystopia is that, not every scenario is going to turn into The Walking Dead. Pandemics happen, you have world market recessions, you might have comet events, you could have a lot of things. And history generally does show, I think, and James can correct me on this, that people don't always go into survivor mode, where they're eating each other for food. Human beings tend to bond more than hunt each other more. And I think that is a natural human instinct. That probably is how, earlier humans evolved into social animals, because they realized the benefits of the herd or the group. And so I think anytime an event like this happens, you have disequilibrium. You have, James was earlier making a comment about the city, and, you guys were talking about the random Olympic part. And I was thinking, well, there's going to be someone somewhere who's going to want to create an algorithm that predicts where the city is going to go next. And so the power of commerce that builds up around the city, or the prestige, is they're going to want to control that. Someone is going to figure out a way to control that based on the frequency, based on whatever. I mentioned this holometer in the beginning that picks up space-time vibrations. And so I think people, while there may be such disequilibrium and greed for power, solidarity probably still trumps. And I am an optimist, so I'm going to stick with that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being here. Usman, James, can you let people know where to find you and to follow your work?
Certainly. I mean, what a pleasure being here. I really enjoyed this so much. My website is www.jmzgraham.com. But what a treat to get to talk to you, Usman, about this really fun story.
Thank you so much, James and Bob, for doing this, and making me a part of this. Was really fun. Folks can find me on Twitter at Usman TM, USMANTM. I also have a website. It's usmanmalik.org, USMANMALIK.org. I am hopefully going to have a collection coming. I haven't really announced this publicly, sort of, so this may be that public announcement. But I might have a collection coming out early next year. I'm working on it. It's going to be published in Pakistan only, and I am working on a project with about 8 local artists. They're going to be working on the book with me, so I hope that people will look it up and maybe read it.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll look forward to that. This was a pleasure. This was a great story. Like I said, if you haven't read it, you can go on our website, csi.asu.edu. You can read that story. You can read all of the other Us in Flux stories. You can get a replay of today's talk. You can watch all of our previous events. If that's not enough, you can also follow us on social media at Imagination ASU. And we'll be back in 2 weeks for a new story for Us in Flux. Until then, stay well, everyone. Thank you so much, James and Usman, and we'll see you again.